Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Utility User Tax, Optimizing Revenue for California Cities. My name is Ali Maynard, and I will be your host for today's webinar. In this session, we'll explore the critical role that utility user tax plays in generating revenue for local governments, and we'll discuss strategies to ensure your city is maximizing its UUT collections. From legislative updates to modernizing tax ordinances, in sharing real world success stories, our experts will guide you through the best practices for navigating the ever evolving landscape of utility taxation. Before we dive into our agenda, I'd like to take a moment to introduce today's speakers. First, we have Amy Jenkins, the president and founder of Precision Advocacy, known for her extensive work in government relations, particularly in California. Amy will be guiding us through the latest legislative updates affecting utility user tax. Amy, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Next, we have Ben Fay, a senior partner at Jarvis Fay, who will provide an essential legal update, focus on modernization of UUT ordinances to meet the evolving technology challenges. Hi, Ben. Thanks so much for being here today.
Hi, pleased to be here.
Also joining us is Keith DeMartini, Finance Director of the City of Santa Barbara. Keith oversees the city's $578 million operating and capital budget, as well as all financial operations, including budget management, tax collection, and investment management. Keith will share his city's success story in implementing UT processes and the importance of adopting new trends in digital services. Thanks for joining us, Keith. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Finally, we have Mike Portis, CPA and Vice President of Audit Services at Avenue Insights and Analytics. Mike has worked in state and local tax for almost 27 years, and he will discuss the role of comprehensive audit programs and partnerships in ensuring local governments capture their fair share of UUT revenue. Hi, Mike. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ali. Glad to be here.
Awesome. And before we dive deeper, let's briefly take a look at Avenue's role in partnering with state and local governments across the U.S. With more than 40 years of experience, Avenue has helped over 4,500 clients optimize revenue and manage services. In California alone, Avenue monitors and reviews more than 70% of UUT revenues, recovering over $300 million for its clients. Avenue continues to make significant impacts on government operations, and today's webinar will provide valuable insights into our strategies and successes. And moving on to our agenda, we'll start with an overview of the utility user tax, where Mike will explain its critical role in funding essential public services in California, as well as the challenges local governments face in maintaining UUT revenues. Amy will then provide a legislative update covering key bills, court rulings, and upcoming legislative actions that will shape UUT administration in the future. Following Amy, Ben Fay will share a legal update focusing on how cities can modernize their ordinances to adapt to the changes like streaming services and new utility consumption trends. Then Keith DeMartini will talk about Santa Barbara's success story, demonstrating how cities can modernize UUT processes, leverage technology, and achieve significant efficiency. Lastly, Mike will wrap up with the importance of maintaining compliance and finding the right partners. Now I'll pass it off to Mike to introduce the concept of UUT.
Thank you, Ali. So what is a UUT? The utility user tax is a local tax imposed on the consumption of utility services such as electricity, gas, water, sanitation services, and various telecommunication and cable services in the state of California. It's collected by the utility providers and remitted to the local government, and it's imposed by approximately 163 jurisdictions, most of which are cities and towns, but there are 4 counties and 1 special district that impose a utility user tax. The rates are between 1 and 11% at this time. The utility user tax impacts local jurisdictions by, number one, being a revenue generator. It's unique in its flexible application because, as I mentioned, in the opening, that it can apply to a variety of utility services. So it's a flexible and broad application. And then it offers a stable revenue source. It adapts to changes in technologies so that if in the winter or seasons and technology, so in the winter, gas goes up, electricity goes down, presumably, or vice versa in the summer, or as people switch from landline telephones to wireless, the telecommunications revenue might go down, but the wireless will go up. Or when people transition from hard cable to video streaming services, the cable services revenue go down, but the streaming revenues go up. So it's a very flexible, broad type of tax that is a good tool for local jurisdictions to use to generate revenue. Next slide, please. The utility user tax does not come without its challenges. First and foremost being changing technology and changing laws. As I was mentioning, technology, streaming, the type of cellular communications we use, that presents some challenges in how the utility user tax is applied, and how your local ordinances apply to that technology. Not just in how to tax it, but how to administer the taxation. What are your procedural methodologies, and do they need to be updated? Have they been changed over the last 20 or 30 years? Another challenge is the local jurisdiction's ability to monitor their remittances. Do you have insight into how much the utilities are paying and some trend analysis? Do you have insight as to whether the utilities are taxing everyone within the jurisdiction's limits? These are, challenges that many jurisdictions face. And one that I think we all face is limited staff. We're all challenged for resources nowadays. And then lastly, it's, as I stated, utility user tax is kind of a unique tax, and not a lot of people have the knowledge of the tax and are educated in its application and how to audit it and how to monitor it. And that's where a proactive, comprehensive revenue protection program and good partners like the people in this webcast, all working together can help you run a good utility user tax program that's well maintained and comprehensive and efficient. So next, we're going to have a legislative update with Amy Jenkins.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Welcome, everybody. Pleased to provide a brief overview of what's been happening legislatively. We actually just completed the 2023-2024 legislative session. The legislature actually gavelled down by midnight, August 31st, but that was not without a lot of chaos. In fact, I'm kind of describing that last and final day as a chaotic conclusion. There were a number of bills that were quickly moved out of the legislature during that time, and it was also marked by unusual tension between the administration, Senate, and Assembly, particularly in the final moments before the legislature gavelled down. During that day, the governor called a special session on oil and gas prices. The Assembly appears to be poised to participate in that session. The Senate does not. There was also a lot of traditional gamesmanship, which we see oftentimes in the final days of session, where the houses were holding on to bills longer than necessary to make sure the other house focused on core priorities. And so you saw a lot of those dynamics. Ultimately, in the end, the legislature addressed a range of significant issues, including a ban on leaded aviation fuel, AI regulation, affordable housing, jobless aid for undocumented immigrants, etc. One of the the real interesting dynamics was just on Wednesday before session adjourned, we saw a warehouse proposal in AB 98. This was an infamous gut and amend, which means that they took contents of a prior bill, stripped it out, and added a very comprehensive warehouse regulatory proposal that, again, is not UUT related, but something all cities are going to have to review because it's going to affect every local jurisdiction in the state, assuming the governor signs it. So again, a lot of activity in the final few days. The governor has until September 30th to sign or veto all legislation. So that was triggered once the legislature gavelled down. So I'm still personally recovering from all of the chaos and dynamics, but again, happy to cover a little bit more about UUT. But first, a couple other just dynamics to know, which I think is important. We saw about 2,000 bills introduced this year. That's pretty standard. I anticipate that going into 2025. A couple other things I'll just highlight is we're going to see we have new leadership in the Senate and the Assembly, and we're going to see some changing dynamics with potentially new chairs going into 2025, which also certainly impacts our legislative work and how we strategize on what bills to move forward and maybe what not to contemplate depending on those political dynamics. So going into UUT specifically, interestingly enough, there has not been a lot of legislative activity. In fact, we haven't seen a UUT related bill really since 2020, but I think it's important to go back and cover a little bit of that history because we are going to need to pursue legislation in 2025. So of course, as Mike noted, utility taxes are paid by consumers on utility services. They're obviously an important revenue generator for the state. There was a lot of dynamics really beginning in 2014. For wireless customers on service contracts, carriers collected UUTs and remitted them to local jurisdictions. That continues to this day, but again, there's been a lot of legislative changes. So before 2014, collecting UUTs, for example, from prepaid wireless services was challenging because there was no ongoing contract to facilitate tax collection. And this created significant gaps in local revenue from mobile services and necessitated legislative action. So here's kind of a history of key legislative actions in response to that inability to collect on prepay. And that started in 2014 with the introduction of AB 1717. And that was Prepaid Mobile Telephony Services Surcharge Collections Act. This significantly simplified the process for collecting UUTs from prepay wireless, and it included two tracks. So one component was CPUC fees for universal service programs and OES 911 services. And then the second component of it was, again, established a process for collecting local UUTs and local 911 fees. So that was the components of this bill. And then subsequent to the bill's inaction, there was a court case, Metro PCS versus Pickler, in which the federal court ruled that the state collection component was unconstitutional. And so that prompted some additional legislative changes. Now, I want to note that this did not impact local collection, just the state collection, but it prompted, again, 3 subsequent bills. So beginning in 2019, you saw Senate Bill 96, and this was directly in relation to the court case. So this changed the calculation method for state collection of 911 fees to a flat fee while retaining the local collection mechanism. But that required some additional changes. So in 2019, we saw SB 344. This extended the sunset date for the Local Collection Act to January 1, 2021, providing an interim solution while the state was still working out what statutory changes were needed to codify both the state and the local collection components. Fast forward to 2020, this was the year I started working on legislation on behalf of Avenue. We co-sponsored a bill which extended that Local Collection Act for an additional 5 years to January 1, 2026. And again, this is the collection from prepaid wireless services. The bill also incorporated all the necessary administrative procedural components so that we could continue to collect UUT from prepaid services ongoing. Now, I want to note that this bill, when originally introduced, would have extended this program to collect prepaid wireless services, UUT from those services indefinitely. However, it was also that year that the legislature decided to impose it's the Rev and Tax Committee decided to impose what they refer to as a 5-year sunset date. So most tax extensions now are 5 years only. And so as we look ahead, and we'll go to the next slide, as we look ahead, we're going to need that extension. So again, as I noted previously, there's been no new legislation since the bill SB 1441 was introduced in 2020. We did, of course, have a ballot measure that I think a lot of local jurisdictions were paying close attention to. This was introduced by the California Business Roundtable, among other business groups, known as the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act. This was a significant ballot measure proposed for the November 2024 ballot, and it aimed to restrict the collection of state and local taxes by and including UUTs. Fortunately, that ballot measure was challenged in the courts, actually by the Newsom administration, and the California Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the Taxpayer Protection Act proposed changes that were so excessive that they amounted to a constitutional revision, and that triggered removing that ballot measure from the ballot. So that was a big victory that was celebrated by local jurisdictions across the state, and that would have had a very significant impact on UUT. So again, looking ahead, next slide. We have future legislation that is going to be needed. So SB 1441, again, the ability for locals to collect UUT on local prepaid mobilist telephony services does need an extension. As I previously indicated, the legislature typically only has an appetite for a 5-year extension. So we will be going back when the legislature reconvenes in January of 2025 and introducing a new bill so that local jurisdictions with UUT can continue to collect that tax, again, on prepaid mobilist services. So we had a lot of robust support and participation from local jurisdictions when 1441 was introduced in 2020, and we hope that you'll all stay tuned to support Avenue's efforts when we introduce an extension of that tax going into 2025. So that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions that might be needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. That was very informative. So next we'll move into the legal update with Ben Fay. Take it away, Ben.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to talk about what you can do to make sure your UUT ordinances are up to date, which will help maximize collections. I'll also discuss a few new legal developments. It's very important to make sure your UUT ordinances are up to date, that they address changing technologies, and capture as much revenue as possible. To make these revisions, however, will almost always require voter approval because you will be extending the tax to new technologies. Therefore, you'll be applying it to services that would not be subject but for the amendment. You should also make sure that your administrative procedures are up to date to make the collection smoother and more effective. These revisions generally do not require voter approval, and they can go a long ways towards making your ability to capture all your UUT revenue more effective. I will talk specifically about telecommunications UUTs because that's an area that is particularly changing very rapidly. You want to make sure you capture all forms of telecommunication. This includes not only traditional telephone and cable, but also video conferencing like Zoom and streaming video, both of which are displacing more traditional telecommunications. For example, cable TV is being replaced with streaming, and video conferencing, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, is eating into telephone. The first step is to see if your ordinance covers these services. Many of the modern ones do, but some do not. And if a service is not included in your ordinance, adding it will require voter approval. Streaming in particular is a significant source of potential revenue, which can offset the decreasing revenues from cable. It is also at the moment a source of litigation because the streaming industry is trying to resist this. A few important things to note. If you want to collect from streaming, you also have to apply the same tax and same tax rate, importantly, to both cable and satellite. Now, satellite might seem a little surprising to you because federal law prohibits a city from requiring a satellite provider to collect and remit UUT. Nevertheless, you have to, on your books, apply the tax to satellite, even though it's pretty impossible to collect. And this is required by the Federal Internet Tax Freedom Act that requires even taxation to all forms if one of the forms is coming over the internet. Another thing to consider is whether you've provided the notices under Public Utilities Code Section 799 to service providers. PUC Section 799 requires notice be provided to service providers of a new UUT or when you've changed it, increased the rate or something like that. Until you provide that service, they're not required to remit. Now, with streaming and video conferencing, you have the unusual situation that they may only have started offering paid services after your most recent tax went into effect. Normally, you don't have to provide that notification, and frankly, legally you don't, because the notification is required when you change it. When they come into your jurisdiction and start providing a service, it's up to them to know what your laws are. Nevertheless, streaming platforms have argued in response to when this has been applied to them, the UT, oh, you didn't provide this 799 notice. Now, I think that's legally wrong and should lose. However, if you're not planning to force them to pay retroactively, you might want to consider providing the notices. That puts them on notice, lets them know they need to start thinking about collecting and remitting, and to defangs this argument. Because one thing that they particularly hate is having to go back and pay back taxes because they can't get that from their customers generally. That's already, they've already charged those customers for those services. That comes out of their pocket. Unlike paying going forward, they charge that, they pass it on to their customers. But again, not legally required to do the 799 notices if they've entered your jurisdiction. Something to think about to avoid that argument and to put the issue on the table. Now, administrative procedures, as I mentioned, those are very important for collections. And what I'm going to describe also applies to your other taxes, such as transient occupancy taxes, business license taxes. For all of these, it's very important to have a good, solid, comprehensive administrative process. One that addresses every possible situation, because you want to, if an issue comes up, you want to be able to address it administratively. That makes sure you iron out any problems there may have. Sometimes there is a problem and the service provider points it out. It's good to know before you're in litigation. It enables you to build a good record for why you're doing. And if you have a good process, if you are then sued in court, they're limited to the record. They don't get to go on discovery and take depositions and draw this thing out for a long time. It's a much more streamlined process and one that's easier to defend. So what should you make sure is addressed in your administrative procedures? Well, you want to address the situation where no tax has been collected, where tax has been collected but not remitted, when not enough tax has been collected or remitted. Importantly, when too much tax has been collected and remitted. In other words, there's a process for them to apply for a refund. And you want to be able to address any claims that state or federal law limits the amount you can collect or outright prohibits it. Again, this insulates you from a lawsuit. And it's important to cover all of these points because unfortunately, I've seen many times in UUT ordinances, it may address the situation where, say, the tax is collected but not remitted, but doesn't seem to address the situation where it was never collected in the first place. It seems like a distinction without a difference, but it can be very important. It's also very important to have a clear administrative statute of limitations. This establishes how far back you can go. Say you discover a service provider has not been collecting enough tax. Well, how far back can you go? Can you go back 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? This is a frequent point of contention in this tax and other ones. And there are legal ways to infer an administrative statute of limitation. The best thing is have it clearly stated. 3 years is the most common. You can have more. You just have to clearly state it in your code. This should not be confused with the statute of limitations to bring an action in court. That's different. That should also be clearly stated. Again, the default is 3 years. It's best to just clearly state it, and then there aren't any arguments. Your procedure should have 2 levels of review. First, there should be the ability of staff to make a determination, i.e. how much tax wasn't remitted, what's owed. And then the ability for them to request a hearing in front of the staff. And that's actually a very helpful process because, again, you learn more about it, you build the record, and sometimes, not infrequently, you change the assessment because you learn something new. Then you need to allow for an appeal from that staff determination, usually to the city manager or a designee of the city manager, maybe a hearing officer. I do not advise a hearing to the city council. You do find that in particularly some older ordinances. 2 problems with that. One, it becomes very political. And the other one is it's very hard to keep documents confidential when they're in front of the city council. The Brown Act doesn't have a lot of exceptions for things like that. And you're dealing with tax returns and confidential tax information of a company that has important protections. And so you get a conflict there. So it's really best to remove an appeal to the city council. It's also important for the ordinance to make it clear that a service provider who fails to collect and remit is liable for what they failed to collect and remit. Some service providers argue that adding this requirement requires a vote of the people. I disagree. You're not making them liable. You're not imposing a tax on them. You're making them liable for the damage they caused by failing to do their obligation, their duty, their legal duty to collect and remit. And the damage is you haven't got the tax, so they have to pay it. There's a case in the sales tax context explaining that, and I think it applies just as well here. I have run into a situation where a ordinance does not clearly state that they're liable for taxes they failed to collect and remit, and a court said, you can make them collect going forward, but you can't hold them liable for what they didn't. So it's really important to put that in there. And most ordinances have that. Lastly, ordinances should provide for penalties and interest, and most have this. They're good for 2 reasons. Ongoing interest, I think, is important, not capped at some point, because that keeps them from dragging their feet. It makes them want to resolve it because the liability keeps growing. They also create a good bargaining chip. Often you'll find that you can get the service provider to start remitting, pay some back taxes if you waive the penalties and interest. So it's a useful thing to have there. And again, as I mentioned, particularly with the statute of limitations, you want to make sure that when you start the process, I should mention, you need clear audit provisions. You need to clearly state how an audit begins, how far back you can go to collect it, and its scope. It also should provide that an audit tolls the statute of limitations. This, again, can be implied by law, but it's better to make it clear. Again, I have had the situation where a company drags its feet throughout the audit and then say, hey, the statute of limitations is expired. Then you have to argue, no, it hasn't. And by law, it's implied that it is told. Just state it. It's very clear to have it in there. And again, this makes the companies work with you and prevents them from dragging their feet. Few new legal issues I want to discuss. A very important one that a lot of us are watching is this case Beck versus City of Canyon Lake. The trial court in this case held that Proposition 218 prohibits general taxes as UUTs on the use of water. And there's quite a number of those across the state. It's in front of the 4th District. If they uphold it, this would probably also apply to sewer and garbage UUTs that are general taxes. And so this could have a very significant impact if it's upheld on appeal. Another issue I see bubbling up is taxing bundled video services. For example, it's one thing to apply a UUT to streaming like Netflix or Disney, where it's a clear single charge. But what about Amazon Prime? You also, when you pay for that, you get streaming service. You also get free delivery and other things. Got to figure out how to deal with that. Same with video conferencing. Zoom, lots of straight charge. But what about Microsoft Teams? That's part of the whole Office suite. So again, how is that going to be applied? Another issue that I think will start coming to the fore is dealing with solar panels and electricity UUTs. This is potentially a very political issue. For example, when a homeowner or business has solar panels and they sell electricity back onto the grid through net metering, does that deduct from the electricity they bought off the grid and used? Technically, no, it probably shouldn't, because the tax is on the use of electricity, not the purchase or sale of it. But like the climate credit, I suspect the utility operators are deducting that. Don't know for certain. Another question is going to be, do you charge tax on electricity generated and used by a homeowner or business from their own panels? Technically, they're using it. Yes, it's self-generation. I think this would be politically very unpopular. And there's the practical problem. How are you going to measure it? How are you going to build them? You don't have a service provider to build them. I think this will become a bigger and bigger issue as solar spreads and more people get batteries and are pretty much self-sufficient. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. One last thing I want to touch on is a user tax. It's not a utility user tax. So maybe it's a little odd to bring it up in this context. But it's a user tax. And again, cities are often looking for potential sources of revenues. This is a user tax on transportation network companies, or TNCs. And it's a fancy name for ride-sharing apps like Lyft or Uber. They cause significant impacts in cities. They add a lot to traffic congestion. They're quite an impact, and you don't get any revenue from them to offset that impact. Through very successful lobbying in Sacramento, Uber managed to make it very difficult to impose a business license tax on the company. And then in another push, they made it difficult to apply business license tax on the driver. However, that leaves open a user tax on the user. And in 2020, the city of Berkeley passed a TNC user tax. It's 50 cents a ride if you pick it up and sit the ride in the city of Berkeley, which frankly doesn't add a lot to the ride, but does become a significant source of revenue. It's collected by the TNC company and remitted to the city. They haven't objected. There have been no legal challenges to it. They did provide political opposition. They successfully convinced the city of Oakland, for example, not to put it on the ballot. They tried to do the same with Berkeley. That didn't work. So this is one approach that some cities can consider. Anyway, that completes my summary of the legal update, and I think I'll pass it on back to Mike.
So Ben, thank you. That was really interesting. I'd like to say something that applies to what you just spoke about. And in my view, and in the work that I've done, Ben mentioned the procedural rules, and I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to have good administrative rules, because you want to have a clear, easy to follow, and fair taxing regime with regards to your local taxes. You don't want your local businesses and taxpayers to think that they're getting dealt a bad hand. And Ben made the comment about getting a refund. You want the people to pay the tax that's due. So equally important as having rules and regulations with regards to taking their money, you need to have rules and regulations to give it back if they overpay. That's very important. And Ben, could you reiterate real quick when and what requires voter approval and what doesn't? Because I wanted you to emphasize that the procedural stuff doesn't usually require it going to the voters. That's something that can be handled without.
That's a very, very important distinction. Essentially, if you amend your code in any way that would cause somebody to pay more tax or to pay tax if they hadn't paid any before, then you have to go to the voters. So the basic one is you increase the tax rate. That's easy. But if you change your definition such that now you've broadened the definition of what it applies to, that has to go to the voters. But with procedures, you're not making anybody pay more tax. So that does not have to go to the voters. I did mention there's a circumstance where you're holding the service provider liable for taxes they fail to collect. They try to say, that has to go to the voters because you're now making us pay tax. My response is no, we're making you pay damages for not doing your statutory, your legal obligation. And I think that's a strong argument. But you may hear that. But the important question is, does this theoretically make somebody somewhere pay more tax? If the answer is yes, then you have to go to the voters. I also just want to mention my excellent point about you really want your procedures to be fair. The way I was talking, it sounds like, we're trying to find the way to get the most money out of customers, out of businesses. You want them to be fair though, because both politically, and it's just more efficient if you have and it stands up in court better if you have a clearly fair process that lets the service provider customer come in and say, hey, you're doing something wrong. And if you are doing something wrong, and it happens, these are complicated, that they get their money back. That's very important.
Thank you very much. So next we're going to move into Santa Barbara's dialogue about their experiences with the UUT and other issues that they've experienced. And Keith DeMartini, would you like to go ahead and tell us what you've experienced?
Yes, thank you so much, Mike. Appreciate it. And thanks again for joining us today. Just talk a little bit about our strategic partnership with Avenue. We've had a successful collaboration with staff from Avenue for really over a couple of decades now. I've been here with the city for about 4 years, so I stepped into that partnership and really happy to see it moving along and really expanding our partnership with the Avenue team. The Avenue team provides comprehensive audit and compliance support services for us. They have been for, again, a couple of decades, primarily with sales tax, UUT, and business license tax. Those are the three tax sources that we've contracted with them on. In 2022, we launched the online business license tax portal. That was a really, really large, significant project for the city. It was a big change management project in regards to how our over 16,000 businesses here in Santa Barbara interacted with the city on an annual basis, filing their for their business license tax certificate. We went online. Prior to that, people were only submitting their remittances in paper copy and remitting it most of their tax through as a check and mailing it to the city here in City Hall. So we implemented the online portal where people can remit their taxes online and pay with a credit card and file their forms online. And that was really in response during COVID. People were expecting to interact with the city in different ways, not wanting to touch paper, not wanting to come in person here in City Hall and be able to do things electronically from the comfort of their office or their home. And so that was really a response to our businesses wanting to interact with the city in a different way. Things that we're addressing with our strategic partnership is to really increase efficiencies, increase transparency, really just make our customer service, our interactions with the public much better. And so it also helped us address some of our budget constraints. Like many cities across California, we've had some budgetary challenges in regard to some plateauing revenues, and really just our expenses continuing to grow at a larger rate than our revenue growth. And so we've had to find ways of optimizing our processes, implementing technology to streamline our processes, reduce paper, reduce postage, reduce staff hours associated with certain projects so that they can be redirected on other more analytical type work here in our finance department. And really, we've been able to increase our transparency and our communication with the public as well, which is, again, sort of a really good thing for our public perception. Ash, go to the next slide, please. Thinking about whether or not our engagement with Avenue has been successful, what really is our return on investment? There are a couple key metrics that I look at fairly regularly to make sure that is where we want to go and where we want to continue. One is just looking at our processing time, right? How much time does it take for someone on my team to process a business license? We look at that. We've implemented a lot of electronic processes. We've reduced our paper, our postage, our need to buy envelopes, our need to purchase toner. And those things might seem like small purchases individually, but when you put all of them together, it actually does result in a pretty large amount of cost savings annually. And it's in line with some of our really aggressive clean energy sort of environmental goals as an organization, reducing some of those purchases. So that's a really good thing. Again, I mentioned we have over 17,000 businesses here in Santa Barbara. And our last count is that just over 88% of them were able to take advantage of our online portal and pay electronically in that way. I forgot to mention earlier, the online portal is not just for business license, it's also for UUT. And so the businesses that remit UUT to us also leverage that portal, which means we receive our money quicker. They're able to file electronically as well. And so it really has streamlined a lot of our tax remittance processes. We have a really large Hispanic population here in Santa Barbara, and many of them require or desire Spanish translation services. And I'm really happy to let people know that through our partnership with Avenue, we've been able to achieve a really high standard on language translation services for our really diverse population here locally. And then also just freeing up staff time. You know, we have lots of pressing needs, lots of new regulations coming down on us, lots of analytical work that my team would much rather do than have to work on processing a paper application. And so I'm really happy that we freed up a lot of staff time to be able to accommodate that. Next slide, please. So just thinking about UUT specifically, we've been able to, again, optimize our payment processing through our UUT audit and compliance process. We partnered on really strategic comprehensive audits for specific UUT areas. And one report that we get from the Avenue folks on an annual basis, it's called the Revenue Management Report for UUT. It's a great report that sort of summarizes the current legislation that's going on. And it really is a way for us to prepare our annual UUT revenue forecast. It gives us some really great economic indicators to be able to do that. So really happy to have that report on an annual basis. One audit that is really strategic for us at this time is for our digital streaming services audit. So this is, you know, what Ben and others have been talking about to see if our existing modern UUT ordinance applies to digital streaming services such as Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, ESPN Plus, and many others. We initiated that audit a couple of years ago, back in January of 2021, again in conjunction with Avenue. And we believe that our existing ordinance applies to those streaming services. And the legal validation has occurred over the last couple of years. So despite multiple challenges from Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus, we have exhausted the administrative processes outlined in our UUT ordinance. And the tax administrator's decision, which is myself, I serve as the tax administrator for this organization, the independent hearing officer upheld our decision in its entirety against Disney. And there is ongoing litigation that is occurring right now, and we do expect to have some conclusion by the end of the calendar year. And the way that we're looking at this strategic audit is really it's really a recovery. It's to address the loss of prior year UUT revenue that we were collecting from those folks that had originally subscribed to your traditional cable service, right? People maybe aren't using cable TV anymore, and they're now leveraging streaming services. Well, we're not looking at it as a brand new tax. We're looking at it as replacing tax that has decreased significantly over the past couple of years. That really concludes my part of the presentation. Thanks again, Mike.
Thank you, Keith. That was very interesting. Thank you. And we welcome the partnership with Santa Barbara. It's a great one. Thank you. So just a few comments about Avenue. We're your partner. We're our clients' partners. We're not the end all, be all, know it all. We are a collaborator that works with you, your local jurisdictions, and our partners like Amy and Ben and Keith. You know, we all work together to solve the problems that local jurisdictions all across California are facing. So we bring that collaborative expertise, we bring comprehensive support, and we bring a commitment to excellence. Our employees and our partners live and work in the cities and towns in California, and we want it to be a great place to live, where the taxes and the business licenses and fees are fairly and equitably imposed and collected. And we want to work with our clients to do the best job possible. And I think that we're proud of our company, and we're proud of our track record, and we appreciate the opportunity to work with our current clients and look forward to working with others. And it's webinars like this and partnerships like this that really showcase how Avenue and Precision Advocacy and Jarvis Bay and the city of Santa Barbara all come together to solve the problems that we're facing. So we appreciate you helping us with this webinar guest, and we appreciate all of you that are listening to this. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you to all the speakers for sharing your expertise with us today. I'd like to just quickly recap the key takeaways for our discussion today. We kicked off the webinar by giving an overview of utility user tax and underscoring its importance as a critical revenue stream for public services and showing how Avenue's comprehensive audit services ensure that local governments receive their fair share of utility revenues. Amy Jenkins provided a legislative update highlighting recent and upcoming legislative changes, including the impact of new leadership in key bills like the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act, which could significantly transform how local governments administer and collect UUT. Ben Fay gave us a legal update outlining the need for cities to modernize UUT ordinances to keep up with the advancements in technology. He discussed the importance of staying current with evolving legal changes, and his legal perspective on adapting ordinances and ensuring compliance was particularly valuable for cities navigating today's utility landscape. Keith DeMartini shared Santa Barbara's success story, where he explained how the city's leveraged technology to modernize its UUT collection process, yielding cost savings and enhancing public service delivery. As we wrap up today's discussion, it's clear that optimizing UUT revenues requires a proactive approach, from staying ahead of legislative changes and legal challenges to embracing modern technology and audit solutions. In addition to today's webinar, Avenue will also be offering biannual legislative update sessions, and we will invite all registrants to join these future meetings. We encourage you to consider these strategies and enhance and share today's discussion to optimize your UT revenues in your own jurisdictions. Avenue is here to support you with tailored solutions, whether you need guidance on legislative matters, audit assistance, or help modernizing your UT processes. Thank you again, and thank you to our speakers, Amy Jenkins, Keith DeMartini, Ben Fay, and Mike Portis. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today, and thank you all for participating in today's discussion.